Fissures. Let's keep going, and you can make 2 movies if you want here. The longitudinal cerebral fissure is this fissure right here. It separates the brain into right and left hemispheres. That's the longitudinal cerebral fissure. That makes sense. Whoa, longitudinal cerebral fissure. Longitudinal cerebral fissure right there. Next fissure is the lateral fissure. That's right here. Separates the temporal lobe from the frontal and the parietal. That's the lateral fissure. And the transverse fissure separates my cerebellum from my cerebrum. So it separates the cerebellum from the cerebrum. That's my transverse fissure. Those are those 3 fissures. Now, sulci are grooves. Gyri are bumps. And we have a real famous or special sulcus here called the central sulcus. The gyrus in front of the central sulcus is called the precentral gyrus. The gyrus behind the central sulcus is called the postcentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus is primary motor area. The postcentral gyrus is primary somatosensory area. Somatosensory. I know your paper doesn't say that. Your paper says primary sensory cortex. But it's really somatosensory. Because what about vision? That's occipital lobe. What about hearing? Temporal lobe. What about taste and smell? Insula and frontal and temporal lobe. So what does this postcentral gyrus do then? Somatosenses. Not special senses, but somatosenses. All right, if I open this brain, I'll leave it open and show you how some brains is better than others. If I open the brain, I have a cingulate gyrus right here, right above the corpus callosum. And by the way, these white fibers here are called the corpus callosum. This gyrus right here is the cingulate gyrus. That means that this gyrus right here above the corpus callosum is the cingulate gyrus. The cingulate gyrus is part of your limbic system. Your limbic system is your emotions, your anger and your love and your jealousy. All of that is limbic system. So the cingulate gyrus is a big limbic lobe where anger and love and jealousy reside. All right, cingulate gyrus. Commissures. We have 3 commissures. Commissures, it's in the lecture, but if you didn't see the lecture, let me tell you what commissures are. 3 types of fibers in the brain. One is called association fibers. Association fibers stay in one hemisphere. Short association fibers connect one gyrus to another within a lobe. They don't even leave the lobe. And longitudinal association fibers leave lobes and connect a gyrus to another gyrus across lobes. So they're long association fibers. So the arcuate fibers are short association fibers. Arcuate fibers are short. And longitudinal association fibers are long. They interconnect lobes. All right? Arcuate. Oh, I shouldn't. Well, I did it in lecture anyway. I'm not going to go in and tell you about the fasciculi and the arcuate fasciculi. I did it in lecture. All right. So those are association fibers. What about the fibers that connect right and left hemispheres? The fibers that connect right and left hemispheres are called commissural fibers. Commissures. There's 3 commissures here. There's this corpus callosum right here. Corpus callosum. That's the major set of commissural fibers connecting right and left hemisphere. There's this anterior commissure right here. Right here. Anterior commissure. And then there's this posterior commissure right here. Now this is where it gets confusing and you have a lot of little things to learn. And watch this. Anterior commissure. Mammillary body. Optic chiasma. Interthalamic adhesion. Superior colliculi, inferior colliculi, posterior commissure. Pineal gland. Habenula. And I hardly move my stick. All of these structures are in this little circle right here. And I'll do them again. Inferior colliculi of the corpus quadrigemina. Superior colliculi of the corpus quadrigemina. Posterior commissure. Pineal gland. Habenula. Interthalamic adhesion of the thalamus. Thalamus. Hypothalamus. Anterior commissure. Did I say posterior commissure back here?
Yes, you
did. Okay, good. Anterior commissure. As you guys know, I misspeak sometimes. Anterior commissure. Corpus callosum. Mammillary body. Optic chiasm. Okay, so all those little structures right there. Those are the commissures. I have a couple more structures. I have this right here. That's actually not a good one. That one's not any better. Yeah, I'll do all of them. I'll do all of these brains right here. This structure right here is called the fornix. Right above the fornix is a membrane called the septum pellucidum. Right here is the fornix. Right above the fornix is a membrane called the septum pellucidum. It's a membrane, so you're going to say, what's behind it? What's behind it is nothing. Space. What's behind that membrane is space. Well, we actually call it something. We call it the lateral ventricle, but it's just space. So here's the fornix. Here's the septum pellucidum. Here's the fornix. Here's the septum pellucidum. Above the septum pellucidum is the corpus callosum. Above the septum pellucidum is the corpus callosum.
What's the purpose of the space?
It holds cerebral spinal fluid. The lateral ventricle behind that septum pellucidum holds cerebral spinal fluid. And then the hippocampus. The hippocampus is probably one of the trickiest things to see on the brain. So let me show you where it is. Let me put this brain back together and take it apart slowly so you can see where it is. Okay. Recognize my half brain. Half brain. If I stick a stick through my lateral cerebral fissure, I'm hitting the insula. If I stick my finger through my lateral cerebral fissure and I curl it down, I'll hit my hippocampus. In other words, my hippocampus is at the base of my temporal lobe, but inside it. So let me take off my temporal lobe and let me look at the base of my temporal lobe inside. And it's right there. That's my hippocampus. My hippocampus is where I store memories. All right. It's also part of the limbic system. So it's involved in memory storage and it's part of the limbic system, your emotions. All right. That's the hippocampus right there. Any questions about the hippocampus? This is why you memorize easier when it has an emotional context. So if I make you very, very angry or very, very happy, you will learn better. If you're just kind of blah, you're not going to learn that well because I'm not linking the new material to some kind of emotion. I suppose I could take a cattle prod and make you very, very angry every time I teach you something new by zipping you with a cattle prod.
You could also give us prizes.
Well, that's the very happy part. Okay, ventricles. Now, on the brain, let me show you something. Behind this septum pellucidum, on both brains, let me put these brains back together. Behind the septum pellucidum of both brains are lateral ventricles. So these brains are together. These two half brains, they come apart. Here's a septum pellucidum. If I were to stick my stick through that septum pellucidum, I hit a lateral ventricle. If I stick the septum pellucidum is missing on this side, so right there's a lateral ventricle. That cavity up in there's the lateral ventricle. Here's what the lateral ventricle looks like. It looks like this, I call this a Jaguar-shaped thing.
It looks like a car piece.
Yeah, it looks like a Jaguar on my Jaguar car out in the parking lot. If you went out and looked at my Jaguar car, on the front hood, it has that Jaguar jumping off of it. Kind of looks like that. We can go out and look at my car later if you want. I mean, we'll see. So there's the lateral ventricle. One of them's 1 and one of them's 2. I don't know which one's 1 and 2, but these are both lateral ventricles. They're funny shaped. Both lateral ventricles. All right. Then you notice, by the way, you got to be careful of something. This is a model of empty space. These ventricles are empty space. Well, they're filled with cerebral spinal fluid, but they made a model of a cavity. So now the model looks like the cavity looks like it's solid material. Remember, this is actually a cavity. Right. So this is the lateral ventricle. Going from the lateral ventricle to the third ventricle right here is this interventricular foramen. It runs from the lateral ventricle to the third ventricle, and it's called the interventricular foramen. So the cerebral spinal fluid can flow from the lateral to the third through this interventricular foramen. Notice I'm not pointing to that hole. I'm pointing to this interventricular foramen. The interventricular foramen is not. The interventricular foramen is not the hole that that stick is in. The interventricular foramen is not the hole that that stick is in. The interventricular foramen is this part right here running from lateral to third. Here's the third ventricle, the ventricle around that hole. All right? This, what my fingers on are here, this is called the cerebral aqueduct right here. It runs from the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. And here's the fourth ventricle. Now, likely, one of the most important things I can do for you is this. Let me show you guys something. Very, very cool. And you need to do this for yourself as well. I promise you that some of the spatial orientation stuff will make sense if you do this. Well, I can't promise that, but hopefully it makes sense if you do this. This is how your ventricles fit into your brain. That fits like that, and that fits like that. Now, obviously it doesn't fit perfect because you can't smush those together completely, but it fits like that. Now, I want to show you something. Remember what that brown dot was called? It was called the interthalamic adhesion. And likewise, that brown dot right there is called the interthalamic adhesion. And those two interthalamic adhesions come together. Now my two interthalamic adhesions are together. I could reach this stick down in there, and that's near where the interthalamic adhesions are. That stick is in the third ventricle. That stick is in the third ventricle. The interthalamic adhesion, there's only one of them. The interthalamic adhesion runs through that hole. Remember, this is a model of a cavity. That hole is really solid material. I have a model of a cavity, and that hole is solid. That's where the interthalamic adhesion is. If you take this apart and slide it in here like this, and slide this in there like that, and look at it, and think about it, and peek into that third ventricle, you will say to yourself, wow, my lateral ventricle is out here, my third ventricle is down in there, my fourth ventricle is back here. And you will see why somebody might point to this model and say to you, that's the fourth ventricle. Because that is the fourth ventricle. The third ventricle is in here. The lateral ventricle I can't see because it's out in here. But if you take these ventricles, all four of them, and slide them on here, you'll see how that fits together. And those two interthalamic adhesions go through that hole. All right, back to this. Now, my ventricles have choroid plexuses in them. My ventricles have choroid plexuses in them. Choroid plexuses are structures that make cerebral spinal fluid for us. It's a combination of the blood vessels and the ependymal cells, which are glial cells. Remember from one of your first lectures you listened to. There's neurons and there's glial cells. There were 4 central nervous system glial cells: astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, ependymal cells, and I'm missing one. Oligodendrocytes, astrocytes, microglia, and ependymal cells. So these choroid plexuses right here, the artery in the vein, is representing one choroid plexus. That's the choroid plexus of the third ventricle. How do I know? Because the third ventricle is around my interthalamic adhesion. The third ventricle is all around my interthalamic adhesion. That's the choroid plexus of my third ventricle. All right? This is the choroid plexus of my third ventricle right there. Let me show you guys something.